Okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I returned last week from a meeting in Copenhagen with ministers of defense from 14 nations to coordinate our political way ahead in the Defeat ISIS campaign. Chairman Dunford returned yesterday from a chief of defense meeting in Brussels with 28 NATO nations plus his counterparts from a dozen additional nations, and they discussed the military aspects of that campaign. Mr. McGurk, President Trump's special envoy and vital State Department leader to the coalition to counter ISIS, returned a few hours ago from his trip to Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. This is our first opportunity to get together, and we took advantage of that for this conference. So today is a good time to update you, describing basically where we're at, what has changed, and the way ahead. President Trump directed the Department of Defense to lead all departments in a comprehensive review of the campaign. We submitted that report, and after his review, he then ordered an accelerated operation against ISIS. So what does that mean? Two significant changes resulted from President Trump's review of our findings. First, he delegated authority to the right level to aggressively and in a timely manner move against enemy vulnerabilities. Secondly, he directed a tactical shift from shoving ISIS out of seized locations in an attrition fight to surrounding the enemy and their strongholds so we can annihilate ISIS. The intent is to prevent the return home of escaped foreign fighters. I want to emphasize here there has been no change to our rules of engagement, and there has been no change to our continued extraordinary efforts to avoid innocent civilian casualties. Despite needing to go into populated areas to break ISIS' hold on their self-described caliphate, despite ISIS purposely endangering innocent lives by refusing to allow civilians to evacuate, and we continue all possible efforts to protect the innocent. You're all aware of the human costs ISIS has exacted: killed, wounded, refugees, merciless control over those regions they hold, the costs to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon as Syrians and Iraqis have been displaced. In response to ISIS' malicious and unforgivable treatment toward innocents, the world has responded. I emphasize that this is a coalition effort. Since this began in 2014, the coalition has strengthened and expanded. The international team is fully committed at the political and military levels to the destruction of ISIS. A coalition of 68 members, 65 nations with more joining as we speak, plus Interpol, the European Union, and Arab League united in opposition. Sharing intelligence, providing troops and funds for combat, and of no less importance for the post-combat recovery. In late March, our Secretary of State gathered diplomatic colleagues in Washington where they discussed how we would deal with the post-combat aftermath. Secretary Tillerson, Mr. McGurk, and their colleagues in the coalition rightly focused most of their effort on how this ravaged region can recover from ISIS depredations after we free it. 26 of our coalition nations contribute militarily, including more than 4,000 non-U.S. troops in the ground and in the air. Our recent coalition meetings in Brussels, Copenhagen, and elsewhere reflect an energized campaign among contributing nations. Partnering with, of course, the Iraqi security forces in Iraq and the counter-ISIS forces in Syria. So what have we achieved? We have fought ISIS elements from Southeast Asia to Africa. Collaboration among many nations, intelligence services continues to complicate and blunt ISIS operations, even as ISIS continues to pursue and conduct attacks against the United States and our allies through centralized, directed plots, but also through inspired attacks. From the Philippines to Europe and beyond, while ISIS remains dangerous, they are no longer carrying an air of strength. In Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, President Ghani announced we had killed the leader of ISIS Khorasan, plus approximately 2/3 of their strength been killed during very tough operations, mostly in Nangarhar province. France has brilliantly led a 2-year ongoing campaign in the Lake Chad Basin and West Africa to throw ISIS off balance, with 4,000 of their troops on the ground to support our African allies. In Libya, we struck a significant ISIS presence there in January of this year. Our attack against their concentrated strength was highly effective, and ISIS did not own any major territory any longer there. Elsewhere, too, there have been successes. But in Iraq and Syria lies the core area of ISIS, of its geographic caliphate. Recent attacks in Istanbul, Paris, and Brussels were planned and coordinated out of ISIS' so-called capital of Raqqa. Additional imminent threats to many nations require us to move with urgency against all strongholds still in their hands. East Mosul, as you know, has fallen after tough fighting by the Iraqi security forces with U.S. and coalition support. Since January, it is returning to normal with businesses reopening, cleanup underway, and kids back in school. West Mosul, in accordance with tactics changed by President Trump, is surrounded, and our Iraqi partners are in a stiff fight. There is no escape for ISIS, even while we do all that is humanly possible to shepherd the innocent out of harm's way. Tal Afar, which lies to the west of Mosul, is also surrounded, and other pockets of ISIS exist elsewhere in Nineveh, Hawija, and the western Euphrates River Valley of Anbar province. We will continue to fully support the Iraqi security forces and Prime Minister Abadi's government in isolating and destroying ISIS throughout Iraq. In Syria, we support Syrian democratic forces that recently seized Manbij, have taken Tabqa, and are currently attacking with great success to isolate Raqqa. ISIS has additional strength scattered down the Euphrates River Valley to the Iraq border. We will not stop until they, too, are destroyed. I want our Chairman, General Dunford, and our President's Special Envoy, Mr. McGurk, to provide more details, so let me sum up. We are leading a comprehensive international campaign to crush ISIS' claim of invincibility, to deny ISIS a geographic haven from which to hatch murder, eliminate ISIS' ability to operate externally, and eradicate their ability to recruit and finance terrorist operations. Thanks to the leadership and authorities granted by President Trump, thanks to the spirit of dozens of nations committed to this fight, thanks to the nations whose troops have gone toe-to-toe with this terrorist group, with the deepest sympathy for the families that have lost sons and daughters in this fight, and with the greatest respect for the families caught up on the battlefields that we note are also humanitarian fields, we have retaken over 55% of ISIS territory there in the core. Over 4 million people have been liberated, and not 1 inch of territory seized from ISIS has been recaptured from them, recaptured by them. Now let me turn it over to Chairman Dunford and Mr. McGurk for more specifics on our Defeat ISIS campaign. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis and Special Envoy McGurk to update you on our progress in the campaign against ISIS. As Secretary Mattis indicated, our partnered approach has brought significant progress. We've reduced ISIS-held territory, limited their freedom of movement, destroyed a great deal of their leadership, reduced the flow of foreign fighters into and from the region, diminished their financial resources, and I think perhaps most importantly, we've undermined the credibility of their narrative that there's a physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. The Secretary spoke about the territorial gains of the coalition. In addition, coalition airstrikes and ground operations have struck approximately 2,600 ISIS-held gas and oil targets, 1,500 tanker trucks, and that's resulted in ISIS having the lowest revenue at any point since 2014. Coalitions also removed key ISIS leaders from the battlefield. These losses have limited ISIS' ability to plan and direct external attacks, recruit foreign fighters, broadcast their narrative, and fund their brand of terror. In Iraq, we're partnered with the Iraqi security forces. U.S. and coalition forces are providing equipment and intelligence, conducting airstrikes, and advising military leaders. It's important to emphasize that the fighting in Iraq has been done by Iraqi forces, and they've performed remarkably, and has also sacrificed. In Mosul alone, they've suffered approximately 980 killed and over 6,000 wounded. And I just comment as an aside, in addition to the competence that they've demonstrated in Mosul and the sacrifice, the one thing I've seen over time in the 15 months I've been back and forth visiting in Iraq in this particular assignment is the confidence of the Iraqi leadership. Some of you accompanied on my most recent trip, and compared to the fall of 2015 to today, it's very clear when you go over and visit them who is in charge, and the level of confidence of the commanders in their ability to lead and in their soldiers' ability to fight is remarkably different than it was a short time ago. In Syria, working alongside our Turkish ally and partner forces, we've cleared ISIS elements from the Turkish-Syrian border that's stemming the flow of foreign fighters, weapons, and money to ISIS's front lines. And we estimate that at its peak, foreign fighter flow in Iraq and Syria was 1,500 fighters per month. And today we estimate that those numbers are less than 100 per month. In addition, Syrian Democratic Forces are completing their isolation of Raqqa. Raqqa has been the center, as Secretary Mattis mentioned, of planning and directing operations such as the attacks in Paris and Berlin. We're also taking the fight to ISIS outside of Iraq and Syria, attacking their affiliates and any groups that claim allegiance. ISIS is a trans-regional threat, and we have a global approach. Secretary spoke about my recent meeting in NATO. That's just one of many meetings that we have routinely. I'm working very closely with more than 60 of my counterparts to expand the coalition that we have in dealing with ISIS. And our priority clearly is to prevent attacks against the homeland. Our strategic approach is to cut the connectivity between ISIS affiliates and associates, and that's specifically the foreign fighter flow, their illicit resources, and their message. Our objective is to drive down ISIS's capability to a point where local forces, with tailored support from the international community, is able to provide security. And we're doing this today in Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. As Secretary Mattis mentioned, the President directed us to find ways to accelerate the campaign, and we've identified opportunities to do that. For example, we recommended to the Secretary, and President Trump approved, the decision to equip the Syrian Democratic Forces early this week, and in Iraq, the decision to allow our advisors to accompany down to the battalion level, particularly in operations in Mosul, complex urban terrain, where our proximity to our Iraqi partners has enabled us to provide better support. And we're going to continue to look for opportunities to accelerate the campaign in the future. Before I take questions, I want to mention that the progress that we've made to date is a reflection of the professionalism and the competence of our men and women in uniform, our diplomats, and our intelligence personnel. And we're also fortunate to have a strong coalition and brave partners on the ground. I've already mentioned the Iraqi and the Syrian sacrifices. As we approach Memorial Day, we should also reflect on the sacrifices of young Americans. Most recently, Rangers Joshua Rogers and Cameron Thomas in Afghanistan, First Lieutenant Weston Lee in Iraq, and Senior Chief Kyle Milliken in Somalia. Again, thank you. I'll be followed by Special Envoy McGurk.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Chairman, for the opportunity to describe how our diplomatic efforts are working in lockstep with the military campaign to destroy ISIS and ensure it cannot return. As the Secretary and Chairman just mentioned, ISIS has lost 55,000 square kilometers of territory to coalition-backed forces, and ISIS has retaken none of that ground. The reason for that record are close cooperation between the military and civilian departments and agencies, between a global coalition of 68 members, all supporting partners with influence, courage, and capacity on the ground. As the Secretary mentioned, I just returned from the region this morning, including trips outside Mosul and Raqqa, and met some of the brave Syrians and Iraqis who only months ago were living under the terror of ISIS. And to date, coalition-enabled operations have freed more than 4 million people from areas that had been controlled by ISIS. This is a remarkable record, and we're now working to accelerate these effects with pressure on ISIS's capital of Raqqa and their dwindling areas still under ISIS control in Iraq and Syria. During my recent trip, I again witnessed how our diplomats are fully integrated with our military colleagues around a whole-of-government effort to fulfill President Trump's charge to destroy ISIS and ensure it can never return. As many of you have seen, I wish all the American people could see the extraordinary work that our men and women in uniform are doing together with our courageous diplomats on the ground in these areas. When Secretary Tillerson hosted all 68 members of our coalition in March, it was significant that he was joined throughout parts of the day by Secretary Mattis, by Secretary Mnuchin, Director Pompeo, Director Coates, and other representatives from across our interagency. This demonstrated the coalition and to the world our united whole-of-government approach as directed by the President. Such cooperation is enabling an anaconda-like approach to suffocate ISIS of its territory, finances, propaganda, and ability to move foreign fighters. So I'll give you some examples. Before a partner force launches a military operation, we do extensive diplomatic and political work at the local levels to try to set conditions for stability after ISIS. Mosul was a central example of this, where we've seen really unprecedented cooperation between the Kurdish Peshmerga forces and Iraqi security forces, working together, fighting together, and taking casualties together. This cooperation has enabled closer political coordination between local, regional, and national governments to help return people to their homes after the battles are won through an innovative post-conflict approach based on empowering people at the local level to restore life to their communities. And we call this stabilization, and it's one of the primary focuses of our global coalition, led particularly by Germany, Italy, France, UAE, Norway, UK, other key contributors. Stabilization is not nation building. We're not attempting to dictate political outcomes, nor is it long-term reconstruction, where projects are chosen by outsiders, often with no connection to the local community, costing and often wasting billions of dollars. Instead, stabilization is a low-cost, sustainable, citizen-driven effort to identify the key projects that are essential to returning people to their homes, such as water pumps, electricity nodes, grain silos, and local security structures, local police. The initial focus on demining key facilities, because ISIS plants explosives in all of these facilities to ensure people can't return, has been a critical focus of our coalition. In Iraq alone, Iraqis trained by our coalition supporting demining have now cleared 34 tons of explosive material. Following demining, experts come in, local workers from the local area, Syrians and Iraqis, to restore key facilities and enable life to return. This is not glamorous work, but it's working. In Iraq, 1.7 million Iraqis are now back in their homes, no longer displaced, no longer refugees or migrants seeking to flee. That record is historically unprecedented in a conflict of this nature, and we give tremendous credit to the government of Iraq and local leaders who have worked cooperatively to stabilize local areas and return local populations. In Mosul, as the chairman just mentioned, the battle's not over. It's approaching its final stages thanks to the historic and really heroic sacrifice of the Iraqi security forces, Kurdish Peshmerga, supported by our coalition. ISIS is now resorting to barbaric tactics, using civilians as shields to hold on to the territory that they still hold. In areas of the city that have been cleared, however, life is starting to return, thanks in no small measure to the stabilization projects, more than 200 now, that have been supported by our coalition, by the United Nations and the Iraqi government. I visited one of these projects last week, a water treatment plant that had been destroyed by ISIS, and since it has been demined, restored by local workers, and then with very limited coalition support, is now pumping fresh water to 100,000 homes. To date in Mosul, 116,000 displaced civilians have returned, 250,000 boys and girls are back in school, and we're working to ensure that these trend lines continue. Raqqa will use the same model. I just visited a town north of Raqqa where local leaders are organizing for the day after ISIS. And working with local Syrians, as we did before the Mosul operation, we've identified hundreds of critical sites and targets for stabilization projects. After ISIS, we'll work to support demining of those facilities and then their rapid restoration, relying on local workers who know the area and how things get done. The Raqqa campaign will take time, but our core principle holds. After the battle, local people, Raqqawis from the area, should be in charge of their city and enabled to help life return to the streets and invite people to return. A few days ago, I met an Arab leader from the town of Tabqa, a stronghold of ISIS for over 3 years, just west of Raqqa. He described to us the thousands of foreign fighters from as far away as Trinidad and Tobago who terrorize his community, enslaving women, brainwashing children, and committing public executions. He also said he believes that most of these foreign fighters are now dead, and he's working to organize demining initiatives and ensure the streets are safe for people to return and enable the people of Tabqa, the local people of Tabqa, to restore their community. So Raqqa will be no different. Syria, of course, is far more difficult than Iraq. We don't have a government to work with, and we will never work with the Assad regime. We'll require much more from our coalition partners and from the international community. When Secretary Tillerson called on the coalition to support stabilization initiatives back in March, he received an impressive $2.6 billion, much of which is now being spent. But more will be required from our coalition, and we'll look for our partners to to maintain at least 3/4 of stabilization support for every U.S. dollar. The battle for Raqqa is about making the world safer for ISIS, and we will ask much of our coalition partners as they continue to support this effort. And President Trump will have the opportunity on May 25th to discuss these initiatives with our NATO partners, all of whom are NATO allies, all of whom are members of our coalition. Very briefly, other non-military elements of our coalition include counter-finance, counter-foreign fighters, counter-messaging. So no matter where you are in the world, if you join ISIS or recruit for ISIS or distribute propaganda for ISIS, the global net is closing in. The newest member of our coalition, for example, is Interpol. More than 60 countries are now providing data to Interpol to build a global database of known foreign fighters who've worked with ISIS. That database had only 40 people a few years ago. Now it has 14,000 and continues to grow. So in sum, we're working as a united team at President Trump's direction to destroy ISIS and protect our homeland. And the record is encouraging. Nearly 60,000 square kilometers liberated, none of it retaken from ISIS. All of it is held. 4.1 million people freed. 1.7 million Iraqis now returned to their homes. Propaganda output down significantly, its lowest levels to date. Finances down to the lowest levels to date. Foreign fighters unable to travel to Syria. And those who are already in Syria are more likely than ever to die there. This enemy remains adaptive, and the threat will not end with the battles of Mosul and Raqqa, but the end of the phony caliphate is coming into sight, and without telegraphing anything that is to come, the pressure has only started. And we'll work together as a united team, whole of government, to make sure we do everything we can to defeat ISIS on the battlefield, but also in the financial realm, propaganda realm, and make sure they can never return to areas we retake. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGurk. And again, it's an international coalition. It's whole of government here in Washington and across our departments. They've been thrown onto the back foot, but tough fighting lies ahead. They are still dangerous, and it's not going to be over soon, but we're going to continue to press. With that, can we take your questions, Bob?
Mr. Secretary, you described, I think, 2 changes you said the President had made in the general approach in the counter-ISIS campaign. One, I believe you said, was a tactical shift having to do with surrounding ISIS in their strongholds. I wonder if you could explain a little bit the significance of that and say how will that apply to the coming fight in the mid-Euphrates River Valley between Dar ez-Zor and Al-Qaim.
Yeah.
And in the same vein, in that same area, the Syrian government has said that they are going to reassert their authority out in that direction, and that they're going to challenge opposition forces in the south. I'm wondering, given the Russian support for them, how will you navigate that sort of battleground without getting further embroiled in the civil war?
Yeah. Navigating this battleground, this complex battleground, is challenging. We deconflict, as you know, with Russia, maintaining an open deconfliction line with them that's used constantly. But if I was to talk to the tactics, because they actually impact your second question, by taking the time up front to surround these locations instead of simply shoving them from one to another and actually reinforcing them as they fall back, based on the recommendation we made and the direction that President Trump took, we now take the time to surround them. And why do we do it? Because the foreign fighters are the strategic threat should they return home to Tunis, to Kuala Lumpur, to Paris, to Detroit, wherever. Those foreign fighters are a threat. So by taking the time to deconflict, to surround, and to then attack, we carry out the annihilation campaign so we don't simply transplant this problem from one location to another. And that's the approach we take that basically threads the needle on a very complex battlefield. Go ahead, please.
What about out there in that valley area, sir? How are you going to apply that out in the valley when you got that long 100 miles?
I'll leave that to the generals who know how to do those kinds of things. We don't direct that from here. They know our intent is the foreign fighters do not get out. I leave it to their skill, their cunning to carry that out.
Mr. Secretary, I want to follow up on that. As you said, we will not stop after Raqqa. You moved down the Euphrates River Valley. You have Dar ez-Zor there with Syrian troops located there. And I understand some small numbers are still moving that way. And then to the west, you have Al-Tanf which you airstrikes hit some Shia militias heading toward El Tanf. We have U.S. trainers. The Russians struck there at El Tanf last year. So given those two areas, are you worried about El Tanf continuing to be, a place where the militias and the Russians will continue to strike, still under threat? And also with Dar ez-Zor, what do you do as you head down the Euphrates River Valley? Do you just bypass them? Do you coordinate with the Russians? You say here you will never work with the Assad regime. How do you deal with those troops sitting there, Syrian troops? Hey, Tom, I'll start with that. And first, I think, as you know, we're precluded by law from coordinating with the Russians. Having said that, we have for many months now worked very hard to deconflict our operations, and the primary purpose is to ensure the safety of our airmen, our personnel on the ground, and allow us to continue to campaign. I'm confident that we've made progress in that regard over the last couple of months. Spoke to my Russian counterpart as recently as last night. We speak routinely when we need to work through the deconfliction. In addition to the direct communication that I have, we've opened up a 3-star level channel where our J5 here in the Joint Staff routinely communicates with his counterpart in Moscow, and then we have a pretty robust operational link on the ground from our Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar to the Russians on the ground, and we are looking for the Russians to work with the regime to deconflict our operations. I think what you're highlighting is absolutely a fair point, which is the ground is becoming increasingly complex and constrained. But to date, we have been able to deconflict operations. We have a proposal that we're working on with the Russians right now. I won't share the details, but my sense is that the Russians are as enthusiastic as we are to deconflict operations and ensure that we can continue to take the campaign to ISIS and ensure the safety of our personnel.
Will that proposal deal with the Syrians sitting there in Dar ez-Zor?
It will. It will, and we've talked about that as a specific area that requires deconfliction, so we have done that.
And lastly, you talk about deconfliction. Well, it didn't work yesterday, the day before, when you called the Russians and said, get those militias to stop, and they did not. You had to strike them.
That's exactly right, and just to be clear, that was a force protection strike. Our commanders on the ground felt like they were threatened at that point, and their rules of engagement allow them to do that. We've gone back and had a conversation at every level now to ensure that those kind of incidents don't take place again. Last night, I made a commitment that they wouldn't happen again if our forces weren't threatened, and everybody understands what the rules are. So that's what's going to prevent it in the future.
I'd like to ask the two veterans of the Obama administration if the decision at the end of the Obama administration to hold off on arming the Turks and let the Trump administration make that decision, did that have any effect on delaying the assault on Raqqa?
Yeah, David, I can answer that question directly. It did not. One of the preconditions for seizing Raqqa was the isolation of Raqqa, which included just recently completed a very difficult fight in an area called Tabqa, and I think you're familiar with that, where the Syrian Democratic Forces actually had 100 killed in that battle alone. So we are just at about the point where the seizure of Raqqa would have taken place in a normal course of events. So it has not delayed the seizure of Raqqa. The only delay was in our providing equipment to the Syrian Democratic Forces so they can go into the fight. But we were prepared for this decision. We had stockpiled the equipment in the event that President Trump made the decision that he did, and we've been very quickly able to field that equipment to the Syrian Democratic Forces without an operational pause, that is, without a delay in seizing Raqqa.
Let me follow up, if I could. Former administration officials have said at the time in January when this decision was made, the opinion of both the Joint Staff and CENTCOM was that the Syrian Democratic Forces would be ready to begin the assault on Raqqa in mid-February. And here we are in mid-May.
Yeah, David, because we're getting into a more political area where we try to keep our apolitical military complete out, let me just say that any timelines that are given in wartime should be taken with a degree of skepticism. We will try to brief you, we'll try to give you an idea of operation, but you're dealing with a fundamentally unpredictable situation. Only now are we completing the encirclement of Raqqa, and there's been no delay in the effort to do that other than the normal vagaries of the battlefield where we have to deal with an enemy who's trying to defeat us. So far, they have been defeated by the SDF in every single battle they've been in, but it has been a very tough fight, Tabqa being one more example. So they were not able to move more quickly into the attack on Raqqa for purely tactical and battlefield reasons. Yeah, go ahead.
General Dunford, you just said that you've already started arming the SDF. Could you just...
No, I didn't. If I did, I misspoke. If I did, I misspoke. We've been stockpiling equipment. We're prepared to do that.
Okay, so you haven't started doing that yet?
We haven't started doing it. To my knowledge, it should happen here, very soon.
Could you please give us an assessment about the fallout or any fallout with Turkey? And I'd like to address this to
I'll talk about it from a military perspective. First and foremost, we have gone into this with the first principle that Turkey is an important ally, and our long-term relationship with Turkey was critical, and we were going to protect that. And I think, as you may know, as a result, I've gone to Turkey, I believe, 9 times this year. I've met with my counterpart over 15 times this year to make sure that we maintain a very close military-to-military relationship. We did have a different perspective on the best way to seize Raqqa. In our view, the only option that was viable was with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and we are now taking measures on the ground to mitigate their concerns. For example, weapons getting into the hands of the PKK or moving into Turkey, and we've taken steps to make sure that the Turks have transparency on what we're doing and measures to take place, that the equipment that we're providing to the SDF is appropriate only for operations in Raqqa, and that it doesn't find its way someplace else.
If I could have Mr. McGurk address that one.
Similar to Chairman, I think I've been to Turkey more than any country other than Iraq since I've started this job. A critical partner. We cannot defeat ISIS without Turkey, and I consult with our colleagues there all the time. There are talks right now in Geneva about the political way ahead in Syria, because as we're prosecuting the military campaign, there's a parallel diplomatic track, of course, for the incredibly complex situation in Syria. That's something that we are fully coordinated with on Turkey. And particularly the post-Raqqa phase, which I talked about stabilization, that is something where we'll be very closely coordinated with Turkey. So, quick answer to your question, we can't do this without Turkey. We work with them every single day. We have some differences, as we do with every coalition partner, but they're very close allies, and we consult with them all the time.
In your case, it got personal, no? I mean, the Turkish foreign minister was on the record regarding...
We've had some differences, tactical differences with Turkey, again, like many coalition partners, but great respect for the foreign minister. He's a close colleague and contact, of course, of Secretary Tillerson. We see him quite a bit, and look forward to that relationship continuing. Tremendous respect for him and all of the Turkish officials we work with.
One for you, Mr. Secretary, and then for the Chairman as well. I have to ask you, sir, about this latest North Korean missile launch. By all accounts, it was more successful than anything they've done so far. They went to a very high altitude. They came back down into the Earth's atmosphere. So my question for you, how has this missile launch impacted your thinking, your assessment about the North Korean missile threat? And if I may, Mr. Chairman, a different question for you, sir. On counterterrorism operations, you yourself described it, putting U.S. forces down at a lower level, putting them more out front. We saw it in Somalia, sadly, with the Navy SEAL killed. It seems like they're no longer behind advising. So talk to us, if you can, about why counterterrorism forces are more out there in front and the risk they're facing doing that. But Mr. Secretary, North Korea first, if I may.
Yeah, well, I want to talk principally today about the counter-ISIS fight, but on North Korea, we're all aware of the provocative actions they've taken. And there have been cautions given them by nations from around the world. They clearly aren't listening. But there appears to be some impact by the Chinese working here. It's not obviously perfect when they launch a missile, which I think you pretty accurately just described, about going higher and re-entry capability, that sort of thing. But at the same time, we're going to continue to breed the same kind of pressure internationally that we've been trying to. We're going to continue to work the issue. As you know, if this goes to a military solution, it is going to be tragic on an unbelievable scale. And so our effort is to work with the UN, work with China, work with Japan, work with South Korea to try to find a way out of this situation. And we press on. There's many different efforts underway. We have a whole of government approach to this as well, this issue as well. I spend as much time as the Secretary of Treasury as I do with the Secretary of State as we try to craft a sustainable policy forward. But let me ask the Chairman to address your other question.
Hey, Barbara, thanks for giving me the chance to clarify. First of all, we haven't changed the broad guidance to our forces that are working with partners on the ground, and that is they stay at the last cover and conceal position short of the objective, in that they don't actually close with the enemy. The specific case I mentioned was we in the past had been partnering and advising at the brigade level in Iraq. Because of the complex terrain inside of the city of Mosul, the commander felt like being at the brigade level didn't allow them to be at the point where they could provide the kind of advice and combined arms support necessary. So we allowed them to partner at the battalion level. That doesn't change the fundamental rule that applies to all of our forces that are conducting partnered ops, that they would be at the last covered and concealed position and not actually the ones closing with the enemy, because fundamentally when we conduct partnered operations, it is the partners who are actually closing with and destroying the enemy.
But in Somalia, the Navy SEAL you mentioned yourselves who was killed, the department publicly said that he and his teammates were alongside the Somali forces. They were not behind
Barbara,
them.
when you're on patrol, you can't always be in a safe position. The lads know they're not part of a life insurance corporation. They're trained for this, and they go out and they do their job to the best they can. I'm confident that our military forces are carrying out the intent, which is that they do not put themselves forward to do the job the partnered forces actually want to do, but they need our support in doing. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can I ask one more on North Korea, and then I'll switch back to ISIS? There was a press conference today by the North Korean ambassador, and he was saying that the U.S. had the provocative actions, whereas you had said that they had made provocative actions, and he went on to say that there were ICBM tests by the United States on May 3rd and April 26th. One of them traveled over 6,000 kilometers across the ocean. Can you confirm any of these ICBM missile tests? Is there any truth to this? And then switching to ISIS, this may be a question for you, Brett. Who's going to be paying for the government in Raqqa and the security forces in Raqqa once Raqqa is taken?
Hey, Carl, I'll just take the first one, and I can confirm that we did test ICBMs. It had nothing to do with North Korea. It wasn't messaged in that direction. It wasn't pointed in that direction. In order for us to make sure we have a safe, reliable, and effective deterrent, we routinely test our ICBM in accordance with international protocols and in accordance with inspection regimes that are part of those international protocols. So it wasn't intended at all to be provocative to North Korea. And I think to compare, for North Korea to compare what they have been doing to threaten and intimidate their neighbors as well as the United States, to our routine military exercises advertised well in advance with full transparency would be an unfair comparison.
You asked a great question. So when you talk to particular folks who will be involved in the Raqqa operation, the post-Raqqa phase, unanimously, nobody wants the Syrian regime to come back. Regime symbols, regime military forces. In terms of administrative services, teachers, hospitals, who pays those salaries, that is something where Syrians are going to have to work that out. We are not in the business of as I said, nation-building operations. But as you kind of lift the lid over Syria, you see a lot of this happening in areas even where the opposition controls. Teacher salaries, basic worker salaries, oftentimes paid by the government. It's a very centralized state. So these are things that have to be worked out, but what they're unanimous about is no return of the regime. As I mentioned, in terms of working with the Syrian regime, this just reflects reality. I mean, the reconstruction costs of Syria are so high in the multiple billions of dollars. And unlike Iraq, where there's a legitimate government elected by its people, recognized internationally with full global support, the UN is on the ground. You have a huge outpouring of international support to help these communities recover. The reality in Syria is that until there's a credible political horizon, the international community is not going to come to the aid, particularly the areas under the control of the regime. And these areas have been truly destroyed based upon many of the barbaric tactics that they've used. So that's just the reality. So until we find a credible political horizon, you're not going to see that international support pour in. And the EU held a very important conference which reinforced that principle about a month ago. So there's a lot of work to do here, and we'll be doing it in parallel, of course, with the military. campaign.
To follow, if the Assad government is going to be paying the bills, won't the U.S. State Department and international allies be forced to work alongside of him if Raqqa reconstruction gets to that point? Or are you just saying now that Raqqa will not be reconstructed until Assad has left?
Actually, we are prepared to do stabilization. Hundreds of projects identified to make sure the lights get on, everything else. I'll give you a perfect example. The Topka Dam. Topka Dam is one of the most strategic sites in Syria. It provides 20% of all electricity in Syria. It was seized and is now controlled. It was controlled by ISIS for years. It was seized and now controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces. We are working locally to demine the dam as we speak. That is happening. Local forces, local workers that we train to help do the demining, and then getting the workers back to the dam to run the dam. So that's happening now. There's no regime presence there whatsoever. But in terms of these overall relationships within Syria, it is more complex than most people realize when you kind of lift the hood and look what's going on. So obviously that will be worked out. But this battle for Raqqa has some time to go, and in parallel we're working on the civilian and diplomatic aspects of it.
Hey, Missy.
Secretary Mattis, question for you. You mentioned annihilation of ISIS. What would that look like in Iraq and Syria? How do we know when that has occurred, given that there's always going to be a residual threat from this group in both countries? And given the fact that you mentioned these follow-on threats from ISIS in Syria, like in Dar ez-Zor and other areas, does that mean that the American public should expect a long-term presence of American troops in Syria?
This threat is a long-term threat. That's why so many nations have signed up. You don't see a coalition this size if it's some short-term threat or a small regional threat. This is a transnational, long-term threat. Obviously, we'll move against their other concentrations of forces. You say, what does it look like, and what will it look like when we say that we've got success? I think what we'll see is the local security forces, police, that sort of organization can handle it. In other words, we drive them down to a point where the locals can handle that, and it's no longer a trans-regional, transnational threat. So you've got to drive them down to a point that police can handle it. Police can't handle a force that's driving tanks or using artillery or has thousands of fighters and mobile vehicles that allow them to range far and wide. So we've got to drive them down to a point that police elements can handle it.
Can you address the expectations from the American troop presence in Syria? I mean, should Americans expect that they will be there in some numbers for years to come?
I'm not willing to say that right now. I'm not willing to sign up for that. That's not our intent. We're there to drive ISIS to its knees. And as Mr. McGurk pointed out, there's got to be a political solution to the larger issues there. It's not going to be U.S. troops at the point of a gun making that happen. Jennifer?
Secretary Mattis, have you taken a decision or made any recommendations on more U.S. troops to Afghanistan? And has a decision been made how many U.S. troops will be going to Afghanistan? And separately, did President Trump, when he met with the Russians in the Oval Office, did he share classified information, and has that strained any relationships with foreign intelligence services?
On the number of troops, no, I have not made a recommendation yet. What I've done is I've gone to Afghanistan, I've met with President Ghani, I've met with the NATO representatives, and I've met with our commander in the field. I've also been in Brussels and also on the side in Copenhagen, talked with my counterparts there to collect allied input, and that recommendation is being put together by the chairman and myself, and I expect it will go to decision very, very soon, but no, it has not been made yet.
And about the conversation in the Oval Office with the Russians?
I was not there. I know what I read in the newspaper. I will tell you this, I have not been asked. This week alone, I've probably been on the phone with or hosted here in Washington either 9 or 11, I'm losing track of time right now, 9 or 11 foreign counterparts or spoken with Secretary General on the phone and all. The issue has never come up. Yes.
I have a quick follow-up for each of you, actually. General Dunford, when you said that you've been able to quickly field equipment to the YPG or the SDF, I guess, what did you mean by that if you've not gotten any arms? Secretary, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, Courtney, I misspoke. And what I really meant to say was we had stockpiled equipment and we're prepared to quickly field it to the SDF. We haven't started to provide it to the SDF yet, and that equipment is in the form of small arms, ammunition, and machine guns, and as well as some equipment that will allow them to deal with the IED, the improvised explosive device threat. So we haven't actually started to provide that equipment to the Syrian Democratic Forces, but over the last couple of months, in anticipation of that decision, or in anticipation of us having to provide support to some partners on the ground, even if it wasn't the Syrian Democratic Forces, we will stockpile equipment and be prepared to issue that out. And so we'll be able to quickly transition as they finish the isolation of Raqqa now and transition into the siege of Raqqa. We'll be able to take the President's decision and quickly get that equipment to the SDF. Thanks for the chance to clarify that.
And Secretary Mattis, just to Barbara's question, so were you confirming that the North Korean missile launch last weekend did have a controlled re-entry back into the atmosphere?
No, I was not. They went to a very high apogee, and when it came down, obviously, from that altitude, they probably learned a lot from it, but I'm not willing to characterize it beyond that right now.
And then Mr. McGurk, actually, just on, I just want to be clear, are you confirming that the Obama administration had made the decision to arm the YPG or to equip the YPG? To one of the earlier questions, it was sort of put out there, but no one ever really answered it. Can you confirm that the Obama administration
No, that decision was made by President Trump.
Let's go to the back row for a minute. I'm hitting everybody up front, Lori. Go ahead. Lori. Where are you? There you are. Yeah, I saw your tie earlier. I wanted to make sure I hit it.
Thank you so much. If I could go on the annihilation change to encompassing cities, is that something that is going to accelerate timelines, or is that something that, because it's going to be more force requirements needed, is that something that's going to delay timelines? And will potentially, because it's such a force generator, will it require the addition of more U.S. trainers and support?
It is a change in tactics, Lloyd, that we now surround these locations, these concentrations of enemy. Any indication that I gave a timeline, again, I want to make certain you understand, I don't put timelines on forces in the field. They know what the mission is. They do what their professional judgment tells them is possible and what reality delivers to them in terms of a thinking, cunning enemy on the battlefield. We're better. That's proven because they have lost every battle they've been fighting now since the coalition has engaged them. So we will continue that tactic. It does not, I think, relate to a longer campaign. There may be tactical incidents that take longer. I'd defer to the chairman on that. But the bottom line is the foreign fighters don't get out is our intent, or at least is greatly reduced in numbers that get back home again to bring their hate and discontent back. I think that sums it up.
Secretary, I just want to come back one last time to the SDF because it occurs to me that there may be a misunderstanding. There's a Kurdish component of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and there's an Arab component of Syrian Democratic Forces. We have been providing equipment, weapons to the Arab component for some months. So that's been going on. The decision that President Trump made was to provide equipment to the Kurdish component of the Syrian Democratic Forces. I just wanted to clarify that. It's clear in my mind. I want to make sure it's clear in yours. Thanks.
But that's not happened yet.
Not yet.
Can I follow up on this? If you don't mind. Yeah, I want to go back to the TANF operation that took place yesterday. Could you confirm that the targeted Shia militias were Iranians or Hezbollah? And do you see any interest, any vital interest to the U.S. and the coalition to control the whole Syrian-Iraqi border?
Let me take a stab at this. At Ad Tanf is what you're referring to, the force that moved near Ad Tanf. Is that what you're referring to? That was, again, as the chairman pointed out, self-defense of our forces. It was necessitated, sir, by offensive movement with offensive capability of what we believe were Iranian-directed forces. I don't know there were Iranians on the ground, but by Iranian-directed forces inside an established and agreed-upon deconfliction zone. We believe they moved into that zone against the advice of the Russians, or apparently against the advice of the Russians. I can't confirm that either, but it looks like the Russians tried to dissuade them. Next question. Yes, go ahead.
So, bottom line, is this, for American people, is this a major change of the war and its strategy, or is this an extension of what's been happening already? Because President Trump campaigned...
What are you referring to?
You're describing your first 2 points of what's new on the ground, the new...
Okay.
The delegation of authorities, the decision to do surrounding operations instead of previous ones, because President Trump campaigned on the idea that the ISIS war wasn't working under Obama fast enough for him. There was going to be a major change. He even considered firing generals. A lot was put out there. So here we are now with your first comments. Should the American public think this is a major difference, or is this more just a natural progression of what should have happened anyway based on last year's gains?
I'm not quite sure of your question. I explained to you that we went to him with the situation as we saw it, with suggested changes. He discussed these changes with us, with the whole of government, not just the Department of Defense. And we made the decision, he made the decision, we took the decision and executed for an accelerated campaign, for one that includes surrounding the enemy so they can't get out, and all of the ramifications and implications of that. I mean, those are the changes that were going forward. The campaign design end state remains the same, to destroy ISIS. But no longer will we have slowed decision cycles because Washington, D.C. has to authorize tactical movements on the ground. I have absolute confidence, as does the President, our Commander-in-Chief, and the commanders on the ground, as he's proven, by delegating this authority to me with the authority to further delegate it, and they've carried it out aggressively. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to follow up about the Iranian aspect of this. Are you concerned, say in Iraq, that certain armed units have arisen in all this fighting, whether it's the Iranian-backed some of the Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces or the PKK's presence in Sinjar, that the situation has allowed these armed groups to emerge and they'll be difficult to control afterwards?
Yeah, the Iranian regime has been unhelpful. As you all know, some years ago when the Syrian people rose up against Assad, they would have been successful except for the Iranian reinforcements, full support for Assad. That's the reason he was able to withstand that difficult time and be still in position now. So Iran's activities have not been helpful. They've been hurtful. They've extended a war that should have ended long ago. I've been in a lot of refugee camps over my years on active duty, from the Dalmatian coast to Africa and other places, seen boat people pulled out of the water off Vietnam. I have never seen refugees as traumatized as I've seen coming out of Syria. Never. And Iran bears no little responsibility for that situation. Yes, go ahead.
Can I ask you to clarify a couple things? You've given the impression that under President Trump's administration, 55,000 or 60,000 square kilometers have been freed up, and 1.7 million refugees. Can you give a sense of what was actually accomplished before the Trump administration took office that you are building on and you've actually improved on? But you gave the impression, rightly or wrongly, that all this has happened since Trump took office.
I think the data we put out are total figures. I think the Secretary mentioned and the Chairman mentioned the delegations of authority, which has made a difference in terms of the speed of execution. I think TOPCO is an example of that. I'd really defer to Chairman Dunford, but we saw an opportunity. Our military people on the ground saw an opportunity to kind of surprise ISIS with a helicopter, moving them by helicopter, surprise them from behind, and seize the airport, the dam, and the town. And that happened very fast, able to take advantage of a moving situation on the ground because our commanders saw that situation. So I think the speed of execution is significantly, the delegations have made a difference, but the numbers and the data are aggregate.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
We'll take one more question here, as always. Yeah, but ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear about this. We were talking about the campaign since 2014. That's what we're talking about, and you know that at that point ISIS was on the attack. They had the initiative. They were shattering every force in their path. Since then, it's been reversed. We've accelerated. That's the way I characterized it, Tony. I was not saying it all started with us. We've continued. There's been a lot of countries in this for a long time, and we're going to keep right at it. We have changed tactically how we're going to carry it out. We have accelerated the campaign, and that's shown up clearly in our tactical reports that are coming in. But let's take one more question. This is going to be rough here, you know. Go ahead, please.
One more on Afghanistan. General Dunford, in your latest trip, were you able to secure additional commitments from allies for putting more forces into the Afghanistan fight? And would their responsibilities expand into the counterterrorism realm?
Sure. I was not able to, nor did I seek to get commitments for additional forces, because at the end of the day, that'll be decisions made by their heads of state and their parliaments. And as Secretary Mattis said, on the 25th of May, President Trump will be in Brussels, and he'll meet with his counterparts, and I'd expect that that's when you'd start to see some commitments. My focus in dealing with my counterparts was to say that if political decision makers decide on the 25th of May to increase the forces that are in Afghanistan, then we should be prepared to provide those as quickly as possible. The other point that I discussed with my counterparts was that we actually have some unfulfilled, as General Nicholson has spoken about and Secretary General Stoltenberg has spoken about, there's some unfulfilled requirements outstanding today. And so I encourage them to meet those requirements. And what commitment I did receive is that they would all go back and look within their capability to do more in Afghanistan. I was very encouraged by the tone in Brussels and by around the room. I think it's fair to say 28 of the 28 nations sitting around a table all were committed to an enduring presence in Afghanistan and continue to support particularly President Ghani's articulated plan for security.
Are those allies waiting for a signal from President Trump as to how many forces?
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good. I hope you're still up. Good morning.